A teenager walks into a diner every single night, always ordering 2 meals, one to eat and one to go. It seemed harmless at first, just a quiet kid with a routine, but when the waitress decides to follow him, what she discovers will leave you speechless. This isn't just about food, it's about a secret that could change lives forever. Stay with us to uncover the truth behind his nightly ritual and the incredible twist no one saw coming. Before we dive into this powerful story, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love stories that inspire, surprise, and move you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The diner buzzed softly with the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversations as Emily Jacobs cleared a booth near the window. It had been a long day and she was already thinking about her sore feet when the door jingled. She glanced up and saw him, the teenager. He was as punctual as ever, stepping in right on time like clockwork. Emily had noticed him weeks ago. He wasn't the kind of kid you'd easily miss, though he certainly seemed to prefer blending into the background. He always wore the same faded hoodie and carried a scuffed-up backpack. The way he walked in, quiet but confident, made her curious right from the start. He never made small talk, just nodded politely and slid into his usual booth in the far corner by the window. 2 meals again, I bet, Marge muttered as she wiped the counter. Marge had a way of saying things that made you think she knew everything, even when she didn't. Emily smirked and nodded. It's like clockwork with him, always 2 meals, same order every night. As if on cue, Alex sat down and looked up at her, ready to order. 1 chicken fried steak and, another one to go, he said quietly, handing her cash. Always cash. He didn't even glance at the menu anymore. Coming right up, Emily replied with a friendly smile. But her mind was already racing. Why 2 meals? Why every night? The questions lingered in the back of her mind every time she saw him. It wasn't just the routine, it was something about him. He was polite, maybe even overly polite, but there was a tension about him, a slight edge that she couldn't quite place. The next evening, Alex showed up again, just as she knew he would. Same booth, same order. Emily brought the plate over, setting it down in front of him. She noticed how he barely touched his phone, though he glanced at it every now and then, as if waiting for something. She couldn't help herself. So, 2 meals again tonight, huh? She asked casually, trying not to sound nosy. Alex looked up briefly, his expression unreadable. Yeah? For now? For now? Emily tilted her head but didn't press further. She watched him eat quietly, his eyes darting to the clock on the wall every few minutes. It was like he was on some kind of schedule. And then, just like every other night, he paid for his meals, tucked the to-go bag into his backpack, and left without a word. Later that night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. She mentioned it to Marge as they closed up the diner. "I'm telling you, something's weird about that kid," Emily said, tying her apron around her waist for the next morning's shift. Marge shrugged. "He's probably just a quirky teenager. Maybe he's got a big appetite, or maybe he's running meals for someone." Emily frowned. "But why the same thing every night? And he's always in a hurry. It's like he's racing against the clock or something." Marge chuckled. "Maybe he's got a secret life. Who knows, maybe he's part of some underground food club." Emily rolled her eyes, but Marge's comment stuck with her. What if there was more to it? What if Alex was helping someone? Or worse, what if he was in trouble? The next night, Emily paid closer attention. She noticed the little details she'd missed before, the way Alex checked his watch, the way he scanned the room, as if making sure no one was watching him. And then there was the way he clutched his backpack when he left, like it held something far more important than a boxed dinner. "Emily, you're staring again," Marge teased from the counter. "Do you really not think this is strange?" Emily shot back. Marge shrugged. "Look, people have their quirks. Maybe the kid just likes chicken fried steak." But Emily wasn't satisfied with that answer. There was something about Alex, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized she needed to know the truth. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, Emily mentioned Alex to her younger sister Sarah, who was sprawled on the couch scrolling through her phone. "Wait, Alex Jobs?" Sarah asked, sitting up. Emily blinked. "You know him?" "Kind of," Sarah said. "He's in my grade, quiet guy, keeps to himself. Some people give him a hard time, but he doesn't really talk to anyone." Emily's interest piqued. "What do you mean, people give him a hard time?" Sarah shrugged. "Just the usual high school stuff. He's different. Doesn't hang out with anyone, doesn't do sports or clubs. I've seen a couple of guys pick on him, but he just walks away. It's like he doesn't care." Emily's mind raced. Quiet, polite, and always keeping to himself. Now it made sense why he was so cautious. But it didn't explain the 2 meals. The next evening, Emily decided to push her curiosity a little further. As Alex paid for his meals, she hesitated before handing him his change. "Hey Alex," she said gently, "you okay? You've been coming here a lot lately." Alex froze for a split second, his hand halfway to the counter. "Yeah, why wouldn't I be?" Emily smiled softly. "No reason, just making sure." Alex nodded, took his change, and left quickly. Emily watched him go, her gut telling her that something wasn't right. The questions were piling up. Why was Alex always in a hurry? Who was the second meal for? And why did he seem so nervous all the time? Emily didn't have the answers yet, but she was determined to find out. The next evening, Emily was ready. She kept an extra close eye on Alex when he walked in. This time she noticed something new, the way he scanned the room, as if checking to see if anyone was watching him. His behavior felt more guarded, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. When she brought his food over, she couldn't resist asking, "Hey, Alex, you seem a little distracted. Everything okay?" Alex froze for a split second, then nodded quickly. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Emily smiled, trying to put him at ease. "Well, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. You know that, right?" Alex gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Thanks," he said quietly. But that was all. As he left the diner with his to-go bag, Emily's mind was made up. She grabbed her coat, ignoring Marge's questioning look, and slipped out the door a few minutes later. She followed Alex at a safe distance, her heart pounding. The street lights cast a faint glow on the sidewalk, but Alex didn't seem to notice he was being followed. He walked quickly, his head down, clutching his backpack tightly. Emily kept her distance, sticking to the shadows. She felt a little ridiculous, like a wannabe detective in some mystery movie, but her instincts wouldn't let her turn back. She needed to know where he was going. The streetlights began to thin as Alex turned onto a quieter street, the neighborhood growing darker and less familiar to Emily. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether to keep going. She wasn't used to this part of town, but something in her gut told her not to stop now. Alex turned down an alley. Emily froze for a second, peering around the corner to see where he was headed. The alley was dimly lit, with cracked walls on either side and overflowing dumpsters lining the path. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect a teenager to be wandering alone. She took a deep breath and followed quietly, her footsteps as light as she could manage. Halfway down the alley, Alex stopped in front of a run-down building. Its windows were boarded up and the paint on the door was peeling. A single faint light glowed from inside, flickering slightly. Alex glanced over his shoulder one more time, this time with a look of genuine caution, and then slipped through a side door, closing it softly behind him. Emily stopped a few feet away, pressing herself against the cold brick wall. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she debated what to do next. Should she knock? Wait? Or just turn back? She wasn't even sure why she had followed him this far, but now that she was here, she couldn't leave without answers. She waited in the shadows, her heart thudding in her chest. From inside she could hear muffled voices, though she couldn't make out the words. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, followed by what sounded like a child's laugh. Emily leaned closer, trying to piece together what was happening. The door creaked open slightly, and Emily tensed. She ducked behind a dumpster just in time to see Alex step back into the alley, but he wasn't alone. A woman appeared in the doorway, holding a small child by the hand. Emily squinted in the dim light, taking in their appearances. The woman looked tired, her clothes worn and her face lined with worry. The child, no older than 5 or 6, clung to her side. The boy's cheeks were hollow and his oversized jacket hung awkwardly on his small frame. Alex handed the woman a bag, his to-go meal, Emily realized, and spoke to her in a low voice. The woman nodded, her expression softening as she looked at him with what could only be described as gratitude. The child took the bag eagerly, his small hands clutching it as if it were a treasure. Emily's chest tightened at the sight. She watched as the boy tore into the bag, his eyes lighting up as he pulled out the warm food inside. Alex stayed for a moment longer, saying something else to the woman before turning to leave. He walked back down the alley, his steps quick and purposeful. Emily pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as he passed by. He didn't see her. Once Alex was out of sight, Emily hesitated. Part of her wanted to follow him home, but the other part of her was glued to the spot, staring at the door to the abandoned building. Who were these people, and why was Alex helping them? She stayed hidden for a while longer, watching as the light inside the building flickered and dimmed. The woman and child didn't come back out. Emily debated knocking on the door, but something held her back. She didn't want to startle them or make them feel threatened. As she walked back to the diner, her mind raced. She couldn't shake the image of the child's face, the way his eyes lit up when he opened the bag. It wasn't just hunger she had seen, it was relief, maybe even hope. The next morning, Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring at her coffee. Her sister Sarah walked in, still half asleep. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah said, grabbing a piece of toast. Emily shook her head. "It's Alex. I followed him last night." Sarah froze, her toast halfway to her mouth. "What? You actually followed him? What happened?" Emily told her everything, about the alley, the building, the woman and child, and the way Alex had handed over his meal without hesitation. Sarah frowned, processing it all. "That's really nice of him, but why? Does he even know them?" "I don't know," Emily admitted, "but it's obvious he's been doing this for a while. He's not just buying food for himself, he's taking care of them." Sarah tilted her head, her brow furrowed. "Do you think they're homeless?" Emily nodded slowly. "Probably. The building looked abandoned, and they didn't seem like they had much. I just don't understand how Alex got involved." That evening, Emily watched Alex even more closely when he came into the diner. He looked tired, more so than usual. There were faint shadows under his eyes, and he barely spoke when he ordered his usual meals. When Emily brought his plate to the table, she couldn't help but say, "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world lately." Alex gave her a faint smile. "I guess you could say that." Emily hesitated. "If you ever need help, you can talk to me. You don't have to do everything alone." Alex looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Emily thought he might say something, but then he just nodded. "Thanks," he said softly, before turning back to his food. As he left the diner with his to-go bag, Emily felt a renewed sense of determination. She didn't know the full story yet, but she was going to find out. The next morning, Emily sat at her small kitchen table, her mind racing with everything she had seen the previous night. The image of the little boy clutching the meal Alex had given him lingered in her thoughts. There was more to this story, she could feel it. But what? Who were those people? How did Alex know them? And why was he the one helping them? Emily decided she couldn't just let it go. She had the day off and she knew exactly where she needed to go, the abandoned building. Later that afternoon, Emily parked her car a block away from the building and approached cautiously. The alley seemed even quieter during the day, the sunlight doing little to make the rundown structure look less eerie. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching before stepping closer. The door Alex had used the night before was shut tight, but the windows on the lower level were boarded up unevenly, leaving small gaps. Emily crouched down and peered through one of the cracks. Inside, she could see faint traces of life. A pile of blankets in the corner, a stack of canned food on a broken table, and a few toys scattered on the floor. Her heart sank. It was clear that someone, or several people, were living here in secret. The thought of them trying to survive in such poor conditions made her chest tighten. She carefully pushed on the door, and to her surprise, it creaked open slightly. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The faint smell of mildew mixed with the lingering scent of cooked food, likely the meal Alex had brought the night before. Emily stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. There were makeshift beds made of old mattresses and blankets, a few personal belongings neatly arranged in small piles, and an empty chair sitting near the window. She spotted a faded sign propped against the far wall. It read, "Hope Haven Community Shelter, closed until further notice." So it had been a shelter. Emily vaguely remembered hearing about a place like this shutting down years ago due to lack of funding. It had been a small community effort that couldn't keep up with expenses. Now, it was nothing more than a forgotten building housing people who had nowhere else to go. Emily's heart ached as she took in the scene. These weren't just random strangers hiding out, they were families trying to survive. And Alex, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, had taken it upon himself to help them. Before she could think further, a faint creak echoed from deeper in the building. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. Someone was here. She turned quickly and slipped back out the door, her mind buzzing with questions. That evening, Emily was back at the diner, her thoughts still consumed by what she had seen. She couldn't help but watch Alex more closely than ever when he walked in. Something was different about him tonight. He looked on edge, more so than usual. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out his wallet, and he kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Emily brought his food to the table, trying to act casual. "Hey Alex, you okay? You seem a little distracted tonight." Alex looked up at her, his expression guarded. "I'm fine," he said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. She didn't press him, but as she walked away, she couldn't help but notice him pull out his phone and make a call. He spoke in hushed tones, his voice barely audible, but Emily caught one sentence that sent a chill down her spine. "I can't stay much longer, it's getting dangerous." Dangerous? What could he possibly mean by that? Emily's stomach churned as she replayed the words in her head. Was someone threatening him? Or was it something happening at the shelter? She wanted to ask him more, but before she could, Alex finished his meal, grabbed the to-go bag and hurried out the door. He didn't even stop to chat like he normally did. Emily stood by the counter, watching him disappear into the night. Whatever was going on, it was escalating, and she had to figure it out before it was too late. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Emily decided to follow Alex again. This time she stayed closer, careful not to lose sight of him as he made his way back to the abandoned building. When they reached the alley, Alex paused for a moment, glancing around nervously before slipping inside. Emily waited a few moments, then approached the door and pressed her ear against it. She could hear muffled voices again, but this time there were more of them. She pushed the door open slightly, peeking inside. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. The room was filled with people, at least a dozen, maybe more, families with young children, an elderly man sitting on a crate, and a few others huddled together on the floor. They all looked tired, worn down, but they were talking quietly among themselves. In the middle of it all was Alex, unpacking supplies from his backpack, sandwiches, bottles of water, and small packets of snacks. He moved quickly, handing things out and checking on everyone, his demeanor calm but focused. Emily's eyes landed on the older woman she had seen the night before. She was sitting with the same little boy, helping him unwrap a sandwich, but now Emily recognized her. It was Mrs. Caldwell, one of the teachers from the local high school. Emily hadn't seen her in years, but she remembered her as kind and dedicated. What had happened to her? Emily stepped back, her mind racing. Mrs. Caldwell had been one of Alex's teachers, she realized that much. And now, here she was, living in an abandoned shelter. Later, when Emily returned to the diner, she couldn't shake what she had seen. She started piecing things together in her mind. Alex must have known Mrs. Caldwell from school. Maybe she had helped him during a tough time, and now he felt it was his turn to repay the kindness. But what about the others? How had this many people ended up here? And why had Alex taken on the responsibility of helping them all by himself? Emily knew one thing for sure: she couldn't let Alex carry this burden alone. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. Something that might be putting Alex in danger. This story was far from over. The sun was setting as Emily wiped down the counter at the diner. Business had been slow, giving her too much time to think about the families in the abandoned building. The image of those makeshift beds, the worried faces of the parents, and Alex moving around like a lifeline for everyone there. She couldn't shake it. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't even know where to start. That evening, a regular customer, Mr. Lyle, a retired contractor who loved to chat, strolled into the diner. He always had a knack for knowing what was going on around town. As he sipped his coffee, he mentioned something that made Emily freeze. "They're tearing down that old shelter by the end of the month," he said casually, stirring in sugar. "Big project, turning it into fancy apartments, I hear. Bradshaw's company is behind it." Emily's stomach dropped. "Wait, what? The building in the alley?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mr. Lyle nodded. "Yep, it's been abandoned for years. I guess they finally got the permits to knock it down. Can't say I blame them, it's an eyesore." "An eyesore?" Emily could hardly believe how casually he was talking about it. Those families had nowhere else to go, and in a matter of weeks, or days, they'd be out on the street. The thought made her heart ache. She couldn't let this happen. Emily's concern deepened when Alex walked into the diner later that night. He looked even more on edge than before, his shoulders hunched and his face drawn. She brought over his food, her usual smile faltering as she noticed how distracted he seemed. "Hey Alex," she said softly, sitting across from him for a moment. "You doing okay?" Alex hesitated, then nodded, but his eyes told a different story. As he ate, Emily noticed him checking his phone repeatedly, his fingers tapping anxiously on the table. When he got up to leave, Emily followed him outside. She kept her distance, but this time, she didn't just follow him to the building. She stayed close enough to hear bits of his conversation. Inside the dimly lit building, Alex was talking to Mrs. Caldwell. Emily recognized her voice, calm but tinged with worry. "We don't have much time," Mrs. Caldwell said. "What are we going to do if they come tomorrow?" Alex's voice cracked as he responded. "I'm trying, okay? I don't know what else to do. I'm sorry I can't do more." Emily felt her chest tighten. Alex was carrying the weight of all these people's lives on his shoulders. He was just a kid, and yet he was acting like it was his responsibility to save them all. The next evening, Emily decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. When Alex walked into the diner, she waited until he was seated before sliding into the booth across from him. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Alex looked up, startled. "About what?" "About the building, the families, everything," she said, her tone softening. "Alex, I know what you've been doing." For a moment, Alex's face went pale. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. "Hey, Alex," Emily said gently, leaning forward. "It's okay. I'm not mad. I want to help." Alex hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. "How did you find out?" he asked quietly. "I followed you," Emily admitted. "I saw the families. Mrs. Caldwell, the little boy, I know you've been helping them." Alex's shoulders slumped and he looked down at his hands. "It's not enough," he said after a long pause. "I try, but there's only so much I can do. And now with the building being torn down, I don't know what's going to happen to them." Emily reached out and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "We'll figure something out." Alex looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. I feel like I owe her, Mrs. Caldwell. She was there for me when my dad died last year. She helped me when no one else did, and now she's lost everything and I can't just stand by and do nothing." Emily's heart broke as she listened to him. This kid had been through so much, yet he was still thinking of others before himself. She made a silent promise to do whatever it took to help him and the families in that building. That night, as Emily was closing up the diner, her boss Jim walked in to check on the cash register. He was an older man, gruff but kind, and Emily knew he had connections around town. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to take a chance. "Hey, Jim," she said, leaning against the counter, "do you know anything about that old shelter on Elm Street, the one they're tearing down?" Jim looked up, his brow furrowing. "Why do you ask?" "I heard it's being turned into luxury apartments," Emily said carefully. "Do you know who's behind it?" Jim sighed, nodding. "Bradshaw Development. I've known the guy for years. He's always looking to make a quick buck, but I'll give him credit, he's good at what he does." Do you think you could talk to him?" Emily asked. "Maybe convince him to delay the demolition just for a little while?" Jim raised an eyebrow. "Why? What's going on?" Emily hesitated, then told him everything. About Alex, the families, the shelter, and how they were about to lose the only place they had left. By the time she finished, Jim was shaking his head. "You've got a big heart, Emily," he said gruffly. "I'll see what I can do. No promises, though. Bradshaw's not exactly the sentimental type." "Thank you," Emily said, relief flooding through her. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start. As Emily walked home that night, she felt a glimmer of hope. There was still so much to figure out, but she wasn't alone anymore. Alex, the families, and even Jim were counting on her. She didn't know what the next few days would bring, but one thing was certain: she wasn't giving up. The air in the diner was heavy with urgency. Emily sat at a booth with Alex and her sister Sarah, a notepad spread out on the table in front of them. Alex's face was pale, and his hands fidgeted with the edge of his backpack. Sarah was scrolling through her phone, searching for ideas. "We don't have much time," Emily said, her voice firm but calm. "The demolition is in a few days. We need to act now if we're going to help those families." Alex nodded, his jaw clenched. "I've been trying to find a way, but it's too much. I can't do it alone." "You're not alone," Emily said, placing a hand on his. "We're in this together, and we're not giving up." Sarah looked up, her eyes lighting up with an idea. "What if we hold a fundraiser here at the diner? We could get the community involved, raise money for temporary housing, maybe even buy them more time." Emily's mind raced. "That could work. If we get enough people to show up, it might make a difference. We could also reach out to local businesses for donations, food, supplies, anything." Alex hesitated. "What if no one cares? What if no one shows up?" "Svela," Emily said firmly. "People care more than you think. We just have to make them see what's at stake." The next day was a whirlwind of activity. Emily and Sarah spread the word about the fundraiser, passing out flyers at local stores and posting on social media. Emily even convinced Jim, her boss, to let them use the diner for the event, promising him it would bring in good publicity. Alex, despite his initial hesitation, threw himself into the effort. He reached out to a few classmates, asking for help with setting up tables and decorations. It wasn't easy, most of them didn't know him well, but a couple of them agreed to pitch in. By the time the night of the fundraiser arrived, the diner was buzzing with energy. String lights hung from the ceiling, and the tables were covered with handmade signs explaining the family's situation. A donation jar sat on the counter, already half full from people who had stopped by earlier in the day. Emily stood near the door, greeting people as they came in. She was amazed at how many familiar faces showed up. Regular customers, neighbors, even a few local business owners who had donated supplies. "This is incredible," Alex said quietly, standing beside her. His eyes were wide as he took in the crowd. Emily smiled. "See? I told you people care." The night was a success. The diner was packed and the air was filled with laughter, conversation, and the sound of clinking plates. People were generous with their donations, some giving more than Emily could have hoped for. But it wasn't just the money. It was the sense of community. People stayed to talk, to ask questions, to learn more about the families in need. By the end of the night, Emily felt a glimmer of hope that they might actually pull this off. The next morning, Emily arrived at the diner early, eager to count the donations and plan their next steps. But before she could get started, her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "We have a problem, call me." Her heart sank. She dialed his number immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked as soon as he picked up. "It's the Ramirez family," Alex said, his voice shaky. "They're gone." Emily froze. "Gone? What do you mean?" "I went to the building this morning to check on everyone and their things are gone. No one knows where they went," Alex explained. "Mrs. Caldwell thinks they might have left during the night. She said they were scared." Emily's chest tightened. The Ramirez family was one of the most vulnerable in the group, a mother and 2 young children. If they had left, it was likely out of fear of being caught or forced out before the demolition. "We'll find them," Emily said firmly. "Don't blame yourself, Alex. This isn't your fault." Alex didn't respond, but she could hear the guilt in his silence. Emily, Alex, and Sarah spent the next several hours searching for the Ramirez family. They checked shelters, called hospitals, and even drove around the area, hoping to spot them. It was late in the afternoon when Sarah got a call from one of the shelters. A staff member said they had seen a woman and 2 children matching the description, but they had already left, saying they couldn't stay. "They're scared," Emily said as she hung up the phone. "They don't trust anyone. We have to show them it's safe." Finally, just as the sun was setting, Alex spotted them at a park a few blocks away. The mother was sitting on a bench, clutching her children close as they shared a single sandwich. She looked exhausted, her face lined with worry. Emily approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. "Mrs. Ramirez?" she said softly. The woman looked up, her eyes widening. "Emily?" "It's okay," Emily said, kneeling in front of her. "We've been looking for you. We're here to help." Mrs. Ramirez hesitated, her grip on her children tightening. "I didn't want to get anyone in trouble," she said quietly. I didn't know what else to do." "You're not in trouble," Emily assured her. "But you can't do this alone. Let us help you." After a few more moments of hesitation, Mrs. Ramirez nodded. Emily helped her to her feet, and together, they walked back to the shelter. The experience shook Alex deeply. He sat outside the diner that night, staring at the stars as Emily joined him. "I should have done more," he said quietly. "You've done more than anyone could ask for," Emily said, sitting beside him. "You can't save everyone on your own, Alex. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying." He nodded, but the weight of the situation was still heavy on his shoulders. The morning after the frantic search for the Ramirez family, Emily walked into the diner with a new sense of determination. She had spent the night thinking about what Alex had said, that he felt he hadn't done enough. But she knew they had made progress, even if it didn't feel like it yet. Now, it was time to take the next step. She found Jim in his office at the back of the diner, sorting through some paperwork. "Hey, Jim," she said, leaning on the doorframe. He glanced up with a grunt. "What now, Emily? You've got that look again." Emily smiled faintly, though her voice was serious. "I need your help. Have you talked to Mr. Bradshaw yet?" Jim sighed, setting down his pen. "I made a few calls, but the guy's stubborn. He's not going to delay the demolition just because we ask nicely." "Then we'll have to convince him," Emily said, her tone resolute. "I need to meet him face to face." Jim raised an eyebrow. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." "Fine. I'll set up a meeting, but don't get your hopes up. Bradshaw's not the sentimental type." "I'm not asking for sentiment," Emily said. "I'm asking for time." Later that week, Emily found herself sitting across from Mr. Bradshaw in his sleek office. He was a tall man with sharp features and an air of impatience, tapping his pen against the desk as she explained the situation. "Let me get this straight," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You want me to delay the demolition of a building that's been abandoned for years because some people decided to squat there?" "And not just squatters," Emily said firmly. "They're families, people who have nowhere else to go. One of them is a former teacher who's helped dozens of kids in this community, including Alex Jobs, the teenager who's been helping them. They deserve a chance." Bradshaw looked unimpressed. "I'm running a business here, Miss Jacobs. Delays cost money." Emily didn't back down. For a moment, Bradshaw said nothing. Emily's heart leapt. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "You won't regret this." With the demolition postponed, Emily wasted no time. She reached out to local organizations, including a nonprofit that specialized in housing assistance. She even contacted a former city council member she knew through the diner's regulars, who agreed to help advocate for reopening the shelter. The momentum built quickly. Donations from the fundraiser were used to provide temporary housing for the families, and volunteers began cleaning up the old building to make it livable again. It was hard work, but the community rallied together, inspired by Emily's determination and Alex's quiet dedication. Alex, for the first time in weeks, seemed lighter. He still visited the diner every evening, but now he smiled more, his shoulders less weighed down by worry. Emily noticed the change and felt a surge of pride, not just in him but in what they had accomplished together. 2 weeks later, the shelter reopened with a small ceremony. The building wasn't perfect, there was still work to be done, but it was safe, warm, and ready to house the families who had been living in fear of losing everything. The first night back in the shelter, Emily and Alex joined the families for a community dinner. The atmosphere was filled with joy and relief, the air buzzing with laughter and the clinking of plates. Emily sat at a table with Mrs. Caldwell, who had tears in her eyes as she watched the children playing nearby. "I don't know how to thank you," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice trembling. "You've given us hope when we had none." Mrs. Caldwell nodded, her eyes softening. "He's a remarkable young man, you both are." As the evening went on, Alex found himself sitting next to Emily, watching the scene unfold. "It feels different now," he said quietly. Emily smiled. "Different how? I don't know," Alex admitted. "Like, maybe things can get better, like it's not all on me anymore." "It never was," Emily said gently. "You just didn't realize how many people were willing to help." Alex nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time, he looked like a teenager. Not someone carrying the weight of the world, but just a kid who had done something extraordinary. The story ends with Emily reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about how it had all started with one simple act, a teenager ordering 2 meals every night. She never could have guessed where it would lead. But now, looking around at the families laughing and sharing stories, she knew it had all been worth it. Sometimes it only takes one person to start a ripple of change, and sometimes that person is the one you least expect. As Emily cleared her plate and looked across the room at Alex, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for what they had accomplished, but for the reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could change lives. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat.